Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Lageson, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is the Executive Chairman for the Center for Security Policy and Vice Chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China.
I appreciate very much you being with us and bearing with us for what I consider to be potentially one of the most important programs of this entire series. I've lost track, to be honest with you, but I believe that we are over 185 of these webinars in the Committee on the Present Danger China series, broadly affecting or addressing at least the matter of the unrestricted warfare that the Chinese Communist Party has been waging against this country for decades. For 5 years, they've, by their own admission, been actually amping things up to what they call people's war. About this, among other things, through the writings of two colonels who published a book of that title back in 1999, to destroy the United States, if possible, without fighting. Today's conversation, so enormously timely and important. They are potentially prepared to exercise, and when I say another option for warfare against this country, namely a shooting war. We've talked about this a lot in this series. We've documented the military buildup, the defense industrial base that is just staggeringly vast. By some estimates, their shipbuilding capacity alone is 200 times that of the United States. And to be sure, a lot of it is the case in the future. In addition to all of that, the Chinese Communist Party has put its people on a war footing. And we have documented that as well. All of which is to say, we are now confronting the most, dangerous existential threat to freedom in the history of the United States, I would argue in the history of the world. And what we're confronting most especially is a regime in China that has now gotten itself into profound difficulties involving their economy, their foreign investment, their political situation. All of which is to say, and again, this has been the topic of many conversations in this series, Xi Jinping may have, as have totalitarian leaders before him, gotten to a point where he thinks that war is the safety valve for what is ailing him and his regime internal to China. That by creating a foreign boogeyman, by engaging in combat with that foreign adversary, he can get his countrymen and women rallying around not just the flag, the motherland, but the party. Maybe he can, maybe he can't. But the question is he prepared to risk all to find out? Which brings us to the present moment and why, again, we are addressing the topic today of the failure, the abject and potentially catastrophic failure of our elites, both in government and in the media and in economic space, the financial sector, and on and on. Their failure, ladies and gentlemen, to warn the American people about the true magnitude of the danger that we now face from the Chinese Communist Party and its military and its United Front Work Department and its intelligence services and its biological warfare programs and so much more. In short, the full array of these unrestricted warfare capabilities, and now potentially the kinetic kind as well. We're going to talk about the threat that our countrymen and women need to know about. We're going to talk about the importance of being clear-eyed about it, and of course, what we need to do with the help of the people they have brutalized for the better part of a century, and who I think have every reason to wish to be freed from its apparatus, as we do, having it go away as well. We're going to talk about this, as we often do, in the nature of a sort of level setting for the rest of our conversation, with one of our most, I think, accomplished and influential members of our Committee on the Present Danger of China. That would be Charles Sam Faddis, a man who served in a number of capacities in our government, in Washington State as a Deputy Attorney General, as a military officer in the United States Army, and as an undercover operative of the Central Intelligence Agency for the better part of 20 years. We've asked Sam Faddis to help us take on the kinds of capabilities that we are now confronting from communists is so enormous and so much in need of our honest, forthright address 24. We're going to go to Sam Faddis, who's joining us, as he occasionally has to do, by video.
I am reminded these days, when we talk about the situation with the CCP and Communist China, of a story from the Vietnam War. I think this is circa 1970, if I recall correctly. There was an American Army unit, I think from the 173rd Airborne, if my memory serves, roughly company strength. And they were overrun and effectively annihilated by an enemy force. And the story the command was presenting was that this was sort of the best traditions of the service, an Alamo type situation. These guys were confronted by absolutely overwhelming numbers of enemy forces, fought to the last man, etc., and so forth. It was still a very, very troubling situation in the sense that while the United States ultimately perhaps lost the Vietnam War, was outmaneuvered primarily politically, the U.S. Army was not in the habit of losing face-to-face engagements with the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese. So an inspector general team was sent in to sort of dig into this and figure out how did this happen. And when they got on the ground, what they discovered was that there was really no evidence, physical evidence, this is in the days right after the engagement, that there had been much of a fight. In other words, there were not shell casings all over, there were not craters from mortar rounds or whatever. There were virtually no enemy bodies, and even though the Vietnamese were in the habit of taking away their dead, still no blood trails. It didn't look like this was anything like the Alamo or a pitched fight. And when they dug into this, what they discovered was that the enemy completely infiltrated the position, that the officers in this unit were completely derelict, that they were all hanging out in the CP in the center of the position, neglecting their duties. And the enemy infiltrated, blew up the CP. That's how the fight started. They took out the leadership and then took the whole place apart from the inside out. And yeah, there was not much of a fight because the enemy had gotten inside the wire and infiltrated. And I think that, to me, that's almost a perfect analogy for where we are with the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese threat. A lot of folks, a lot of very, very smart, very respected people spend a lot of time thinking about the confrontation between us and China and speculating about how a full-on conventional war is going to go in the Pacific when we finally throw down with the Chinese and they're landing on the shores of Taiwan. And I'm not dismissing those scenarios. I think in any situation like this, you better be thinking about a whole bunch of different scenarios and not become wedded to one vision of how this has to play out. But I'm not convinced at all that that's what you're going to see, or actually probably more to the point, it's not what we're already seeing. I mean, the Chinese, via the United Front and elite capture and just their overall governmental policies, have completely infiltrated us, the United States of America. And I mean that in the sense of, in some cases, they've just formally recruited people who are assets of Chinese intelligence and pass them documents or do their bidding and are directly compensated in return. But as we used to say in the field in the business of espionage, people get dragged down the rabbit hole, if you will, to varying degrees. So some folks are formal assets of Chinese intelligence. Some are just compromised by the Chinese and have climbed in bed with them and do their bidding because it's to their personal benefit. Some of them don't even really consider themselves to be compromised at all, and yet economically, if nothing else, they're in a position where they've chosen a side, and we're not the side. They have bet on Beijing. And we're not really doing anything. It really is superfluous in that state. We're not doing anything. I mean, we discover that Eric Swalwell, who's a congressman sitting on the Intel committee, appears to be completely compromised and has a Chinese spy in his inner circle. And we accept his assurances that we shouldn't worry about that, and we don't seem to demonstrate any curiosity whatsoever as to how many more Eric Swalwells there are in Congress. Or all of a sudden, Governor Hochul's aide son is discovered, and she and her husband are indicted, and they're functioning as agents of influence for the Chinese government. And that's a big deal for about 30 seconds, and then we move on and completely ignore the fundamental question, which is, well, how many more such individuals are in governors' offices all around the country? I mean, when Fang Fang was sleeping with Eric Swalwell, allegedly, she was established to be simultaneously working and sleeping with multiple mayors of American cities. So that's just one individual, one instance. This is going on an industrial scale. And it's not just that one of these days it will be bad. It's bad right now. And honestly, the war has already started. And it started in more than just the way of compromising our individuals. It started in what you can actually see on the ground or at sea. So right now we have the Chinese waging war on the Philippines, physically ejecting them from areas of the South China Sea that, per international law, belong to the Philippines, to put it in layman's terms, and yet the Chinese are shoving them out, ramming their vessels, attacking their personnel, and they're about 30 seconds from opening fire on somebody and turning this into a true hot war. And there's nothing from the United States. This is a treaty ally, folks, that we have stood by for decades and decades and decades, and to whom we owe formal responsibility. I mean, we have pledged ourselves to defend them, and we're not doing anything. In fact, we're doing everything we can as a government to pretend like it's not happening. So when the Chinese, just to throw out a scenario, blockade Taiwan and begin the not so slow strangulation of that island, because I think everybody who's looked at the situation says that Taiwan can hold out for, maybe 90 days when blockaded, because they're completely dependent upon shipments of food, on energy coming in, oil coming in, etc. When they begin that process, increasingly I am of the mind that you are not going to see a reaction of any kind from the United States that has any significance. There will not be the deployment of the 7th Fleet. It won't matter how many people have hypersonic missiles of what types, or how many carrier battle groups are at sea. Or all of this is going to be irrelevant, because we're going to react exactly the way we are right now to what's happening in the Philippines. We're not going to react at all. So you're going to be waiting for this confrontation, waiting for this explosion. One of these days, we're going to have to throw down with the Chinese and realize too late that this thing doesn't end with a bang. This thing ends with a whimper, as we simply roll over and concede, and you turn around and assess that the Pacific Ocean has effectively now been conceded to the communist Chinese, and the whole balance of power changed in the world, and we didn't do anything about it, because it's not going to be a fight to the last man. It's going to be a situation in which they take us apart from the inside out, and they're already doing that.
I think Frank still has some technical difficulties. So, Dee Dee, would it be okay if I just jumped in and introduced Nicholas?
Oh, thank you, Brian. That would be wonderful.
Anybody who's been studying China these many years would have read a book written, I think, in 1994, if memory serves, called Chinese Intelligence Operations. And its author was Nicholas Eftimiades. And it is a real pleasure to have him with us here today. We often criticize the deep state. And if you look at Nicholas's bio, you'd think he'd be an intimate with that. But he has been the best part of our intelligence community for quite a long time, and one of the best analysts, really, of everything communist China is trying to do to undermine the United States. And it's a real pleasure to have him join us here today. Nicholas, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'll just say also along with that was, so two things happened of interest in my life in that sense. Number one is I published my first work on Chinese intelligence in 1994, which led to a number of congressional hearings and testimony and things like that. So I learned two things out of that. Number one is that the Chinese government publicly declared me an enemy of the people in the People's Daily several years later. And number two, this wasn't easy in our own intelligence bureaucracy. I got beat up a lot, over the course of careers, and I've been in touch with Frank decades, so he will know there's a policy fight in Washington, which unfortunately we lost in that time frame that has gone on for more than a decade, Republican or Democrat, it didn't matter. Our policy apparatus and our response to China has been characterized by ignorance, arrogance, and greed. Ignorance because we were blissfully unaware and perhaps wanted to be unaware of what the Chinese Communist Party was like and what their intentions were. Arrogance because whether it's our Congress or our business community went in with the approach that, inside every Chinese person is a freedom-loving American just dying to get out. And greed because our corporate structure, and I see it now, I talk to companies and, I talk back and forth between commerce and the Intel community and companies. And as one software company said to me, Nick, we're making $100 million a year in China. What do you want us to do? We also are culpable in this. Our policy ranks are absolutely the problem here. We have done nothing to support our industries. We leave them to the wolves. And if you are an American company, you're facing the CCP alone. And that is our fundamental problem. What Frank started out with and talking about unrestricted warfare, and you can go through that book as it was written and look at China's policy now, and you see an exact correlation. to how they're behaving and using our companies, using our technology, using our intellectual property, using our economic strengths against us is an art for them. And they do it. And we are as you know, just pointed out, we're befuddled as to what to do with it and what to do about it. So even some of our national security firms I've seen acting against our national security interests because of the pressure that they're put under and the offensive that they suffer under from the Chinese Communist Party. So these are huge issues we have to deal with. And I mean, I talk into our policy apparatus all the time and say, where do you see the relationship in 10 or 15 years? What's it look like? And it's like a deer in the headlights. They don't respond. I will say it is the one bipartisan issue in Congress now. And so we have an opportunity. In fact, there are hearings on the 24th of this month by the Senate, and quite literally what to do about China. You know, what are our potential responses? But, you know, in the 80s, the U.S. had a different approach. We were dealing with the then Soviet Union. Every element of government was sort of unified in its approach, right? We had, whether it was the Defense Department, even the State Department, and many other elements of government were all focused and pulling the oars in one direction. We really need to move towards a strategic approach to dealing with China at a minimum for a whole of government response. And our state governments, as you pointed out, you know, Fang was actually, I interviewed dozens of people in that, and Fang had probably relationships going between 10 and 15 people, you know, U.S. political figures. So, I mean, this is one person and her outreach, if you will, into the American political apparatus. And we see this at the state level, at the local level now, and as well as at the federal level. So it's something we have very little time to get smart about.
Nick, thank you. And Brian, thank you for stepping in. As I indicated earlier, and was apparently pretty obvious to you all, there were technical difficulties at my end. I think they're fixed now, and I hope that we will be able to carry on. Nick, thank you very much again for your lifetime of service to our country, especially in connection with your mastery of the threat we face from the Chinese Communist Party and your efforts to raise the alarm about it over decades of service. We're proud to have you as a very important member of our Committee on the Present Danger of China as well. The next of our presenters is one of those members too. His name is Trevor Loudon. He has been a very, very generous contributor to these webinars over the 2 years or so that we've been conducting them. His particular area of expertise is the enemy within. And both Sam and Nick have spoken, I believe, about the operations of the Chinese Communist Party in this country, as well as elsewhere around the world, and the threats that it poses to us and our vital interests. What we were hoping Trevor would add to that conversation is an understanding of how this has translated into the kind of lack of situational awareness that we currently are confronting. And when I say we, I mean mostly the American people, but I think it's not inaccurate to describe quite a number of members of our government and other elites. Yes, there are among them a lot who've been captured, and the rest, I think, in part thanks to the work of those captured elites in suppressing information and causing us to look other ways, or lowball the threat, or in other ways obscure what we're up against. Many, including members of Congress, are simply not very knowledgeable about the dangers we're facing, which gives rise to a whole nother aspect of the enemy within problem. So Trevor, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours to go where you will with it.
Well, thank you very much, Frank, and thanks to all the viewers. I want to talk a little bit about Maoism, because, you know, this is where a lot of this infiltration has come from. This is the origin of much of this stuff. Now, in the 1960s, you know, the American, especially with the Vietnam War, a lot of young American kids were radicalized through SDS, the anti-Vietnam War protests, etc. And they weren't radicalized in favor of the Soviet Union. That was seen as old and stuffing and boring. They were radicalized in favor of Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong and the Sandinistas and the Cuban revolutionaries. So what we saw is thousands of young American kids turned to Maoism in the 60s and 70s, very deeply into Maoism. And they all went into factories and set up committees and went into unions and lived underground lives in preparation for the violent revolution. But in the 1980s, when change came about in China, when Deng Xiaoping took over China, and China went down their so-called capitalist road, which was really a reversion to classical Marxism. You know, classical Marxism says you have primitive communism, followed by feudalism, followed by capitalism, then socialism, then communism. And the Chinese openly acknowledge, as do the Vietnamese and do the Russians to some degree, that they tried to go from a feudalist society straight to a socialist society without going through capitalism first. So under Deng Xiaoping, they went back to the capitalist stage to develop their economy, and they welcomed a lot of American investment. And under the guidance of he who hopefully is rotting in hell right now, Henry Kissinger, the American public was sold on this scam, that if we just give everything to China, if we put our industries in China, we can wean them away from the Soviet Union and they'll become friends with us. And we'll all live happily ever after. Well, these Maoists, especially in the 80s, started to move. They abandoned the old revolutionary strategy of working in factories and, you know, stirring up the Black Panthers and just doing street riots. And they started to go into industry. They started to go into the legal professions, the non-profits, the Democratic Party, and into the unions in a big, big way. And I know we can't be partisan here, but we've got to realize this was a left-wing political movement that gravitated towards the more left-wing of the two mainstream political parties at the time. So they went heavily into the Democratic Party. And one of the big entrees of this was the Jesse Jackson Rainbow Coalition campaigns of 1984 and 1988, which were completely run by the League of Revolutionary Struggle, the Communist Workers' Party, the Line of March, and the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. The Jesse Jackson campaign was a Maoist organization, absolutely Maoist, and as were the Black Panthers, by the way. And so these Maoist radicals got entree into the Democratic Party. And now they are very, very well entrenched at all levels of the Democratic Party. But they're also entrenched in business. They're also entrenched in Hollywood, the legal professions, like Goodwin Liu, who serves as a justice, a Supreme Court justice, a Ninth Circuit justice in California, who has done all sorts of horrible things as a judge. Was part of this Maoist movement starting at Stanford University. So we've got this Maoist movement infiltrating business, infiltrating the Democratic Party, the labor unions. The labor unions in America now are pretty much all controlled by pro-Chinese elements. The Teamsters are controlled by the Freedom Road Socialist Organization element. I can go through the list. SEIU is very heavily in with China. So are the teachers' unions, etc. And they also went into the non-profits. They went into education. Some of the big education development places like the Erickson Foundation of Chicago, which produces material for preschools like kindergarten kids all over America, is run by Maoists. They work with the Chinese Communist Party. They do publications for each other. So they are in our education system from kindergarten to PhD with their Confucius Institutes, etc. But none of this could be done if we hadn't had a big influx of Maoists into the system starting in the 1960s, accelerating in the 80s, and coming to fruition, probably the peak of their power in the 90s, early 2000s. The Rainbow Coalition, to talk about it, was the idea. They borrowed this from the Black Panthers in Chicago. You get the white radicals, the brown radicals, the black radicals, the yellow radicals, the lavender radicals, which were the homosexual community, the greens, which were the environmentalists, would now be the Muslims, and you get all the minorities together to form a majority. And you can start winning elections with this. This strategy came out of the Black Panthers and the League of Revolutionary Struggle, one of the main Maoist groups of the 1980s. And so Jesse Jackson did very well with the strategy, and all this racist terminology is their terminology, not mine. And but it was applied because some of these Maoists became very wealthy. One of them, a man called Steve Phillips, married into the Sandler family of San Francisco, the Golden West savings and loan fortune, and had $2 billion to play with. He helped to set up the Center for American Progress. He set up ProPublica. He funded a whole bunch of ballot initiatives and hundreds of candidates around the country. He also met up with George Soros and Tom Steyer and all these people to set up the Democracy Alliance in 2005, a big alliance of about 150 left-wing billionaires and left-wing labor unions, which put billions of dollars a year into the progressive movement. So Steve Phillips updated the Rainbow Coalition strategy. He wrote a book called Brown is the New White, a New York Times bestseller, saying that basically the strategy for the Democratic Party should not be to go after the middle voter. The strategy should be to run progressive candidates of color, particularly in the southern states, and mobilize the communities of color to achieve electoral majorities. Now, they did this, when Jesse Jackson ran, minorities were about 19% of the population. By the time that Obama ran, minorities were well over 30% of the population. Obama ran on the Rainbow Coalition strategy. It was Steve Phillips's wife that gave Obama the first money he needed to get ahead of Hillary Clinton. It was Steve Phillips who got $10 million together to organize voter registration drives in 17 southern states, which got Obama ahead of Clinton in the Democratic primary. This was completely pro-Chinese Maoist forces interfering in our elections on the highest level. And this Steve Phillips gave us Cory Booker, the senator from New Jersey. He gave us Stacey Abrams, who thinks she's the governor of Georgia. And he gave us Andrew Gillum, who almost won the governorship of Georgia. But most of all, he gave us Kamala Harris, who's completely his protege, and he gave us Tim Walz, who is also part of this movement as well, coming out of the Rainbow Coalition. They also run a whole, the existing communists on the ground now run a whole network of voter registration organizations, which claim in their own literature to have turned Virginia blue, to have turned elected senators in Arizona and Georgia, and also claim to have won 6 of the 7 states they targeted in 2020 and 2022 for Biden-Harris. I'm just quoting their work here. I'm not making a value judgment. I'm saying this is what they boast. They had Pennsylvania Stands Up in Pennsylvania. They had Detroit Action in Michigan. They had New Georgia Project in Georgia. They had Lucha in Arizona, which made 1.8 million phone calls and knocked on nearly a million doors in the state. And so what we have is this Chinese-backed, Chinese-influenced voter registration apparatus operating in key swing states. And the Chinese also gave us Black Lives Matter, by the way, which these organizations are using Black Lives Matter activists as the core of their organizations. So what you've got is actually a situation, and these people are at it right now. They call it Seed the Vote, and they're working in Nevada, they're working in Georgia and Pennsylvania. They're sending 8,000 volunteers from the Bay Area to work on the ground in these 6 key swing states. 8,000 of them. So that could have an impact. That could have a considerable impact. So what I'm saying here is that the Chinese have infiltrated. Those Maoists of the 60s are now working in Wall Street. They're working in Hollywood. They're working at the top of the National Lawyers Guild. They're working in elite law firms. They're working in the business community. They're working in sports. And they still have their networks on the ground who are doing the dirty work for them in key swing states. So, as Sam has said and others, if we do not clean this out, we are doomed. It's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time until we have a one-party state in this country, because we know that if one party gets elected and they legalize 28, 30 million illegal immigrants who will then vote 80% for that party, that could be a problem that the other party may have a lot of trouble dealing with in the future. So nobody is really talking about this Maoist infiltration, but we all look at the money side of it, but there's the ideological side as well. The ideological side has been with us since the 60s, and we didn't take it seriously. We basically gutted our intelligence services under Frank Church in the 1970s. The FBI was pretty much forbidden for going after these people, and they have taken over institutions right up and down the scale, working for the CCP, loyal to the CCP. So I'll just call it quits there.
Trevor, thank you. An incredibly comprehensive depiction of the extent of the rot. And I think you've, as ever, been able to document it. I didn't properly give you credit for a number of the books that you've written and the movies that you've made on the subject of the enemy within, not least of which are your multi-volume books, I should say, on security risk senators and House Un-Americans.
I've got a new book coming out in about 10 days, which will deal with this movement and Waltz and etc., their backgrounds and how that all fits into this Chinese operation on the streets.
Understood. Give us the title of the book, please.
It's called Stealth: Kamala Harris's Communist Roots. Stealth: Kamala Harris's Communist Roots. You can go to my website, trevorloudon.com, and see about it there. It won't be on Amazon for a few days yet, but it will be up there too.
What?
Called Stealth: Kamala Harris's Communist Roots. Stealth: Kamala Harris's Communist Roots. You can go to my website, trevorloudon.com, and see about it there. It won't be on Amazon for a few days yet, but it will be up there too.
Wonderful. It's available for pre-order now?
It's available on my website for pre-order if you want a signed copy. And
Super.
It will be on Amazon hopefully later this week.
And that would be trevorloudon.com, as I recall.
trevorloudon.com, yes. Thank you.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Thank you, Trevor, very much. Finally, we're going to turn to the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, who you had a very helpful intervention from earlier in the program. Brian Kennedy is one of our great leaders on so many issues, former president of the highly influential Claremont Institute, now with the American Strategy Group. His involvement with and leadership of this committee has been exemplary, especially for a time such as this. We've asked Brian, who has worked intensively on matters political as well as policy, notably since the 2020 election, trying to ensure election integrity, to talk a little bit about an aspect of this, not in a partisan way, but in a way that hopefully will inform the listeners and the American people more generally about why the sorts of things that we've just been treated to, the sorts of things that make the Chinese Communist Party such a dangerous adversary and such a mortal peril, really, to, yes, the people of the United States, but the constitutional republic in which we have been privileged to live. Brian and I have talked offline about an important insight, I would argue, in our present moment. And that is something that is, as it happens, being featured prominently on big screen movie theaters across the country as we speak. And that is the efforts that my old boss, Ronald Reagan, made to bring down, literally eliminate, the predecessor in terms of existential threats to freedom of the Chinese Communist Party, namely the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It's a remarkable film by all accounts. I have not had a chance to see it myself yet, but I understand that it very, very compellingly describes his conviction that we had to put the Soviet evil empire on the ash heap of history if we were to survive, as well as freedom more generally. The thing that's so important about this, folks, and I want to ask Brian to elaborate on it, is that he not only felt that way, but he went to the American people in the 1980 election and sought their mandate to act on that program and put together a strategy with some of our members of the Committee on the Present Danger China and helped execute them. The strategy and the rest, as they say, is history. But we want Brian to talk a little bit about how that experience, that record, might well be what the times require right now, and how that can, in fact, perhaps be framed in and part of the 2024 election as we need it to be. Brian Kennedy, thank you very much for being with us, and thank you for co-chairing this particular program. We're glad to have you back. Over to you.
Thank you, Frank. Frank and I, by the way, and Trevor, we're all in Milwaukee right now doing one of our World War III, the early years roadshows. And so Frank was traveling, just got in. Trevor and I got in earlier. And so we're looking forward to tomorrow discussing World War III, the early years, and the effects of what communist China has done to the United States, and how we can deal with that today. By the way, in case anyone is in the Milwaukee area, our excellent organizer of the conference, Karen Sigeman from the American Freedom Alliance, says there are still some seats available. So go to AmericanFreedomAlliance.org. If you're in the general Milwaukee area and want to see Frank and myself and Trevor and many members of our team. So when Frank and I were talking about all this, we were reflecting on the fact that Reagan had a much different country than the one we find ourselves in today. When Reagan was governor, then leading up to being president, he had had the experience of being an actor. He himself was the target of communists who tried to bring him down. He was sort of solidified in his political views that communism and the free world were incompatible. And so was always looking for how we win, they lose, as he once said. President Reagan was a member of the Committee on the Present Danger in its iteration from the 1970s, because even in the 1970s, even though there was a consensus in the country that communism was a bad thing, there was not a consensus on how to deal with it and how to deal specifically with the Soviet Union. So Reagan had at his disposal 40-some members of the Committee on the Present Danger back then to turn to when he became president. And he ran on a platform of dealing with the Soviet Union and making sure that they didn't present an existential threat to the United States. And he comes to power at a time when the country, I will say, was much healthier politically than it is today. The kind of intellectual rot we see in our universities had not spread so far through society. And the power of communist China was a fraction of what it is today. The Soviet Union had a tremendous espionage network within the United States. and they had been very influential in intellectually and ideologically corrupting this country. But still, the American people had this really remnant view that America was a good country and worth defending, and that was absolutely essential to our national survival. So that Reagan, when he ran for office and then got elected, had that to turn to. And that eventually led, as we know, to the winning of the Cold War, as it's generally called, the winning of the Cold War by the United States. It turns out, unfortunately, that winning the Cold War really was the reorganization of the Soviet Union into Russia and its constituent states. We didn't disarm Russia. We didn't disarm communist China. We win the Cold War, but that didn't include communist China. In fact, we spent the years after the Cold War building up communist China into the superpower it is today. And the communist Chinese realized rather quickly that the United States was not going to hold them to account, even though they were communist, the way we had the Soviet Union. And they saw that the United States was much more interested in earning a dollar than in actually defending this country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And so the communist Chinese launched this, a series of efforts in order to further corrupt the United States and to penetrate parts of American society, whether it was the university or big business or government, lobbying, using all of their business ties to co-opt all the law firms, all the public relations firms, using their business acumen to get in bed with, big pharma and other big tech, and to basically weave throughout American society this network of people who would stand with communist China in any kind of effort to hold them to account. My colleagues here have described that better than I just did, but it's important to see that the kind of reservoir of goodwill the country had and belief in itself by American elites, let me say American elites, was much stronger back during the 80s than it is today. Today, the belief in America is held not by American elites, but by the American people. The idea that America is the greatest country on earth and worth defending, I think, is alive and well in the hearts of the American people. Donald Trump, and we had just a presidential debate this week, Donald Trump doesn't represent American elites, even though he's a billionaire. He represents the American people and this view that you can make America great again. And by great again, meaning free again and prosperous again, and a country that can deter all of its enemies again. That's not what we have today, which is one reason why we live in the world we do, where you have a uniparty of Republicans and Democrats, the business community, legacy media, all turning against Donald Trump. So we have a presidential debate this week, and what happens? I thought President Trump did a marvelous job in trying to highlight everything that's going wrong in America today. Ms. Harris did, I thought, a pretty poor job, but she simply wasn't going to defend the fact that the Biden-Harris administration has lit the world on fire and there's conflict throughout the world, whether it's Ukraine, the Middle East, or what's going on in Asia, as Sam described. And so in that presidential debate, first of all, the moderators who really had their thumb on the scale against President Trump, they did not mention the fact that he had been, there'd been an attempted assassination on him. That was the biggest news in this year, I think, the fact that the former president had been shot. That was not brought up. That was a little odd. The second odd thing was communist China was not brought up by them. It was discussed obliquely on both sides, but communist China, which has shaped the world we live in today, at minimum because of COVID-19, that was not brought up at all. And so the great existential threat to the United States, Communist China, does not warrant a single question in the presidential debate, or does not merit the kind of focus that one would think a president should weigh in on. So we're living in a time where the legacy media is so corrupted that they decide to take a pass on bringing up the great existential threat of our time, Communist China. I think all of which would lead one to believe that if the forces of freedom in this country are going to prevail, it's going to be because the American people rally to the right cause, that they see what's really going on here. And frankly, you know, I was listening to Trevor and I thought, well, the bad news is Trevor's absolutely right. The good news is the American left doesn't have a real, say, political base other than by fraud. And by fraud, meaning it requires billions of dollars to be spent by Communist China and possibly Russia and others. It takes billions of dollars to corrupt people in order to create the kind of political operation that can get Democrats like Kamala Harris or Tim Walz elected. It doesn't happen organically, in other words. It doesn't happen because Kamala Harris has great ideas and that the American people immediately gravitate to them. It happens because a communist front group and other political operatives spend billions of dollars in order to get a Kamala Harris elected or a Tim Walz elected. It takes real kind of deception and a kind of operational excellence for them to be where they are today. Donald Trump, on the other hand, has, forgive me, a ragtag group of political supporters who organize rallies and who go around the country and really advocate on his behalf. The Republican Party doesn't really advocate on his behalf. It's really a grassroots movement trying to tap into the genius of the American people. And so, even though I listened to Trevor with, as always, with great interest, I was pleased by very much everything he had to say, because I believe if the genius of the American people is really at work, it can overcome those billions of dollars of political organization by Communist China and the left, because the American people still can draw from those principles of their founding, those ideas that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. That still sings in the hearts of the American people. And when President Trump is on the stump and he is explaining to the American people why they have a great country, that's to account for why he is so popular today. And that's why on the left, they have to go to these great lengths in order to match him and his popularity. So that may not be a satisfying answer, Frank, for the condition we find ourselves in today, but I'm strangely hopeful after this conversation, because I see that it does come down to each American believing individually that he or she can make a difference. And if they do and they rally to the cause of American freedom, then that freedom will prevail once again. And I say that in a nonpartisan way, but as someone who, with the rest of this committee, very much believes in the ideas that our founders gave us, and that human freedom will not perish from this earth so long as the people on this call and in this country still believe in it.
Right, thank you. And thank you especially for that note that we are trying to approach these topics in as much of a nonpartisan way as we can. These are times that are obviously trying because there are differences between the parties. Trevor's talked about them quite compellingly, I think. And yet I believe, as an old Scoop Jackson Democrat a lifetime ago, that there are people that are in the Democratic Party. They're not running it, that's for sure, but there are people in the Democratic electorate, the base of the party, that I suspect still hew to what you've said, Brian. We certainly hope so. And it should be, honestly, a matter of not partisan division, that we have a nation like Communist China that is intent by its own declarations on destroying this country. Democrats, Republicans, independents, all of us, would seem to me, have a very, very high stake in getting this issue right. So let me just turn to a couple of questions for this distinguished panel. We've talked a little bit about this whole of society war that is being waged against us by the Chinese Communist Party and as many of their people as they can mobilize for the purpose. I'd like to hear, Nick, from you about lessons that might be learned in terms of galvanizing our own people and raising public awareness here in support of our country. We're obviously not a communist country yet. We're clearly not going to use coercive techniques, but are there things that we could learn from what the Chinese communists do to enlist the help of their people? And often it is coercive, I get that, but the non-coercive piece, whether it's the information piece, whether it's the call to defend the motherland, appeals to patriotism and the like, or what else would you recommend? I mean, I want to leave people today with ideas about what we can do differently that will prevent, hopefully, this moment of national decision from slipping past us without this topic being addressed as it should.
A whole of society approach on their part necessitates a whole of society response from us. I sort of might disagree a bit on the history of how our services and our intelligence and our law enforcement have addressed these sorts of issues, because China has approached the United States in a very different fashion. You know, we saw this very recently with the Linda Sun case, right? Linda Sun, who was an advisor to actually worked for Governor Cuomo and then Governor Kathy Hochul, and for over 10 years. And she was acting as an agent of influence for the Chinese Communist Party, specifically the United Front Work Department under the direction of the Consul General Huang Pi. Okay? So has some elements.
That's the guy in charge of the consulate in New York.
Right. Guy in charge of the consulate in New York, and worked with a couple of political officers, etc. So let's think back in our history. Intelligence threats have always been, you know, that classic picture of spy versus spy, right? It was us and the Russians, us recruiting, you know, Russian government officials and intelligence operatives, and then doing the same to the us. Never did it really, was it so expansive that it went down to the lowest levels of societies, of mayors, of you know, covert influence on governor campaigns. And you know, Linda Sun did some amazing things as a covert operative. I mean, even to the arrogance of writing letters, you know, for forging Kathy Hochul's name, or allegedly forging Kathy Hochul's name, inviting trade delegations in from China. And, you know, there was an extraordinary money movement, which I've seen before in espionage cases. But this is all something we're not prepared for. The FBI isn't prepared for. You know, the CIA, our government structure doesn't exist at that level. And to be frank, the states are not picking it up as well as a function of what to do. So we have this gaping hole, this vulnerability in society. So how do we address vulnerabilities in society? Well, probably first and foremost is education, public education. Okay? And that's just got to exist. Secondly, our states and the Governors Association. And I mean, this is not a secret. The Chinese embassy put out a letter through the, you know, National Governors Association to industry, literally telling them to challenge, and I don't mean figuratively, I mean literally telling them to challenge legislation in Congress with the words, you cannot make money, you know, with this type of legislation going forward in the country. Okay? So we need to partner with our industry, and that needs to be done at state levels, primarily at state levels and federal levels, to be able to provide cover to resist advances from the Chinese Communist Party. And lastly, even things such as the Federal Agents Registration Act that we have need to be extended down to the state level. So Newsweek had identified over 600 organizations in the United States that were beholden to the United Front Work Department, right? 600 Chinese associations and business associations and cultural outreach associations, and that's only in the U.S., right? So tens of thousands of people. You can go on websites and see in some of these things how they literally talk about their connection to the consulates and requiring approval from the consulates for them to do one, two things. So it's as you've all pointed out, absolutely pervasive, like a cancer in society. Education is one thing, but we need to start healing the body, and that requires a public-private partnership to work towards protecting our industries and taking the offensive. You know, there's a lot of Chinese in the country, and that needs to be responded to. We noticed students in the U.S., Chinese students in the U.S., hold virtually the same opinion of the U.S. while they're in college. 4 years, opinion doesn't change. It's a negative opinion, generally. But then the minute they get out of the university, where they're not under CCP control and not seen by other students and such, the minute they get out of the university and on their own, their opinion of the United States skyrockets. Because now they're in society and now they're, oh, I get it. You know, I can make money. I can, you know, they have far more taste of the freedoms that this country offers. We need to focus at the university level too. We need educational campaigns. We need to break the CCP stronghold.
An extraordinarily helpful checklist. Could I just, before coming to Trevor, ask a quick question of something? And you've done a masterful brief, I think, but still very impressive rendering of what Linda Sun has been doing in the course of those nearly, I think it's 11 years in the New York State sort of hierarchy. And you mentioned 2 governors she worked with, but she was in all kinds of operations with a profound ability to advance the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. And again, all of this is laid out in an indictment. It's alleged. She's not been found guilty of anything, but the record suggests, and you've identified one thing that I just wanted specifically to ask you about, that she allegedly, was putting Chinese personnel covertly on phone calls, official state phone calls.
Yeah, discussion of policy.
You know a lot about espionage, but that seems to me to transcend influence operations and get right into facilitating enemy collection of information that could be valuable to them from an intelligence point of view as well. No?
Well, one of the other sufferings that Congress needs to address is our Foreign Agents Registration Act was put in place in 1938, largely to stop Nazi propaganda. It doesn't account for digital propaganda. It doesn't account for anything that happens outside the United States. So it is limiting in some ways, but I got to tell you, as bad as she did, which was literally letting the diplomats listen in on those discussions, and then you can look at the emails and going back and forth, and her crafting a way, stopping Taiwan representatives from having access since 2016 onward. They had no access to governors' offices because she specifically stopped it. So multiple things. The problem is, we can't address all these issues. And I talk to the FBI about this all the time, right? And as Director Reyes said, we have 2 incidents like this a day, 2 cases dealing with China a day. That's 2 times in 24, 365 days, 730 cases a year, over 56 field offices.
And those are only the ones that we know about.
Right. And we're thousands of cases in the rear. Yeah. So arresting our way out of this is not the right way to go. Right. Education, and to be frank, taking an offensive, turning that policy apparatus, that education in towards the Chinese people is a way to go. I mean, it's like the counterintelligence world. Offensive is actually the best thing.
Yeah, best defense, as they say. Trevor, one of the things I admire about you, and there's a lot that I admire about you, but one of the things that I appreciate so much is that in addition to the incredibly detailed, documented research that you do and that you make available through your books, through podcasts, through interviews, through speeches, participation, for example, in the program that Brian kindly mentioned that we'll be doing in Milwaukee tomorrow. World War III, the early years, we call it. You have made it your life's work to take this research to the public, to the American people, as I say, through those various platforms, but also just through dogged, persistent, grassroots level education of the kind I think that really Nick was just calling for. It raises a question again as to whether one of the things that we need to be doing about this, since we want to be not just admiring the problem, but focused on what do we do about it, is a kind of crowdsourcing of the heightened awareness of these various threats, monitoring of them. I'm mindful, just as one example of the problem, and we had a question about it from our audience today. By some estimates, there have been several divisions worth of Chinese People's Liberation Army personnel insinuated across our borders. Mention may have been made of this earlier while I was struggling with my technology problems. But I'm just wondering whether there is an opportunity. We've been told, see something, say something for the past 23 years, since 9/11 at least. But Trevor, as you have been meeting with and training people, is this something that you talk about? And is this something that having their eyes on where these divisions worth of unaccompanied military-aged men are, for example, and making known to the appropriate authorities, presumably the FBI, but state and local as well, as Nick says, that there may well be, operatives in proximity to targets, or simply preparing for getting a go code from Xi Jinping that could very much upend this country. Your thoughts, sir?
Yeah. Well, I think, like in Britain in World War II, they alerted the public to the danger of Nazi spies. And like one Nazi spy was caught because he dropped a chocolate wrapper in a railway station that was a German chocolate wrapper, and a porter saw it and alerted the appropriate authorities, and that man was arrested and executed. So, look, I think we're going to have to put this country, and this is not going to happen under the present administration, but a future administration that cares more about national security, I think has got to mount public programs to actually alert people to the danger and give ways of informing, give ways of alerting people. But there's also got to be incentives. Like if the government said, look, there's $100,000 reward for every Chinese spy caught. You imagine what that would do to the spy networks in this country. And also an amnesty program for those who may have been caught in the network or have been, scammed or blackmailed into cooperating, an amnesty program to get people out of it with freedom from prosecution if they spill their guts, if they tell everything that needs to know. So there needs to be a carrot and a stick approach. There needs to be an incentive to turn these people in, to watch out for these people, to alert your local sheriff if there's something going wrong. There needs to be a program like there was in Britain in World War II, and like there was in America too. People were on the watch for German spies and Japanese spies and this kind of thing. We need to go into that kind of footing. And if we have the incentives, you get $100,000 for turning in a spy, and if you get a conviction, you get $100,000. Or, there's an amnesty, there's a way out if you're willing to come forward yourself and tell us everything, that you will not be prosecuted. I think you could clean this problem up pretty darn quickly. If you instituted a reward for Chinese spies, I think you'd see 100,000 of them leave the country within a month. and if you started prosecuting the ones you caught and not giving them back to China and spy exchanges, giving them 30 years in Leavenworth, you would see a lot smaller problem going forward. And of course, as Nicholas said, proper application of the Foreign Registration Act, but applying it to disinformation, applying it, updating it to deal with the challenges we face now. We have to get serious. People have to go to jail, and we have to treat this as a war situation.
I couldn't agree more. I think that idea of an amnesty program is a particularly brilliant one, Trevor. And I would hope that, and I think this is implicit in what you said, but to make it explicit, this would apply not least to the old friends of China, the captured elites in this country,
especially
that are in a position, to help us understand the magnitude of the danger, because they'd be part of it.
If you imagine if we started an amnesty program and information came forward, and the deal would be, if you come forward and you tell us everything, no prosecution. But if you don't come forward and we catch you, you're going to jail for 30 years. Mm. So immediately, as soon as people started coming forward, everybody be thinking, I better come forward before they catch me.
Yeah,
I better do this now. I might not get a chance.
I want to come back to both you and Nick in a moment, but just Brian, maybe to you. One of the things that, of course, our Committee on the Present Danger of China has been very focused on from its inception, notably in connection with the work that our friend Roger Robinson has been spearheading, is a fairly straightforward idea when you think about it. It's that we have to stop funding this existential threat to freedom. And again, this is a case where the public, I think, has been very poorly served by those friends of China, the masters of the universe on Wall Street, and others who've been sluicing us a portion of their pension funds, 401k plans, mutual funds, exchange-traded funds, and other investment vehicles to the Chinese Communist Party. But could you talk a little bit about this idea? We've got, in fact, in the works, a defund the enemy campaign that builds on some extraordinarily impressive reporting that Maria Bartiromo has done with the help of Roger and a number of others about this idea that we're underwriting our enemy and thereby making them infinitely more dangerous, and how that could become part of maybe this campaign and the public awareness raising and engagement. Because to the extent that individuals have money in China today, they've got, I would argue, two reasons to not want that to be the case. One is it's harmful to the national security, of course, but they're likely to lose every dime of it if it stays there.
That really is a great point, Frank. Picking up on Trevor's point, we're not serious as a country, right? We don't think of ourselves on war footing. We don't think we're in a war with communist China, even though they've declared a war on us. And what Nick was saying, I think is very important, which is the U.S. government no longer sees itself as capable of stopping communist China and their operations in the United States. They've grown too large. So you combine that with the financial piece you're talking about, and your financial types, well, I'll tell you, well, look, our economies are too interwoven. American prosperity depends on Chinese prosperity. And so we have to work together in multilateral ways, so that we both, bilateral ways, however you want to think about it, to make sure that communist China prospers so that we can prosper, and that our economies together drive forward into the future so that Americans can enjoy everything they want to economically and financially. Okay, well, that's the China is not a threat, and we're not going to war, and everything's okay, and just look the other way. Now, if everything is fine, then we can go along investing in communist China. But if they're at war with us, and they say they're at war with us, they declared a people's war against the United States. They launched a bioweapons attack with COVID-19. They're doing everything in their power to prepare for a kinetic war with the United States. Either we take that seriously or we don't. If we take it seriously, we stop right now the investment of United States citizens and investment firms in communist China, period. We witnessed over the last 3.5 years, maybe 20 million people coming into the country illegally. You can call them invaders, but what really are they? They're people who this administration invited in order to change the United States politically and culturally and to destroy American citizenship. Now, if we're serious about America, our Constitution, and the defense of our citizens, if you have a better administration, not this one, you would deport every single one of them because they're not citizens. They've broken the law, period. You have to think that way. If you think that, well, there's just too many of them, we can't deport them, then you're really saying American citizenship is meaningless. A better way of thinking about it would be to say, you're not a citizen, you're leaving. Communist China, you have how many nationals in the United States? 500,000, 1 million? We're sorry, we can't adequately defend ourselves. Our apologies, but they're now all going to leave. Sorry, we're not going to have them in our universities. We're not going to have them doing business with us because you engage in a level of espionage that we simply cannot deal with. And so because of your actions, Communist China, you are now going to have all your nationals take them home. They're going to leave the United States. Either we're going to treat this as if it's a war or we're not. And that includes immigration, how many nationals are in this country, and whether or not we're going to finance any of this. If we're at war, the idea that we would finance Communist China is utterly ludicrous, because to invest in Communist China is to invest in the success of communism. Yes. And if they're at war with us, in the destruction of the United States. I mean, if history will record that we entered a period of national suicide, or if we entered that period, it had to do particularly with Communist China and the fact that we are so, as of yet, unable to deal with them. And I believe that's why our politics today are just so heated, because Donald Trump stood up to Communist China. And you can criticize how he did that, but the fact that he stood up to them and said no more caused the political war we find ourselves in today. And so, you know, thank you, Frank, for organizing all this panel in particular, because if we can't understand this intellectually, I'm not sure what else we can understand.
On just the understanding, that's obviously a critical first step, as you've all said, but we've got to get engaged in having it come out right. Let me do one quick round further, if I may, because there's so much to talk about here and we've got such extraordinary talent. Nick, you talked about FARA, the Foreign Agent Requirement Act, Registration Act, rather, and the fact that it has not really been updated to take into account phenomena like digital means of influencing a population like ours. And there's I don't think any precedent for what we're seeing now with respect to TikTok and the 170 million, I'm told, Americans who are, you know, now with their digital devices feeding directly into the Chinese Communist Party's big data collection operations. And having stuff expropriated that they don't have any idea, their microphones, their television, their videos, and so on, but also what's being fed to them. Could you talk a bit about this phenomenon and your recommendations as a trained intelligence professional as to what has to be done about it, especially since it's clear this is one of the ways in which the Chinese are trying to influence this election?
Of mixed views as a person who's just strong belief in freedom, within this country. I get very nervous with the government regulating and controlling media outlets and things like that. That's always a bad recipe. And we've seen the government, do that with social media, and it never winds up in the people's good, right? When they're controlling or attempting to control social media. However, in this case, I asked myself, would we allow the communist government of China to own the New York Times? Would we allow them to buy the Washington Post? And the answer is no, because of the corruption and foreign influence. And so that's the answer with TikTok. The issue with TikTok is always the fact that, they can run X more ads on one than the other, and it really can shape, and particularly over time, shape public opinion. Despite the fact that just using it allows in the user agreement, allows access to your contacts and tracking you. I mean, that in itself, something else. And estimates say China has biodata on 85% of Americans, right? So we're just adding to that. You are certainly feeding a self-professed enemy. So, I mean, we're in a lot of areas untested legislation, untested, and the technology has pushed us in that. So we do have to have an intelligent way forward. And in this case, I think it's restricting TikTok and restricting access, A, to our markets, and then B, to in particular, our media.
I asked the question in part about TikTok because in connection with the pro-Hamas agitation in this country, of course, we saw recently an episode I'm sure all of you took note of, in which there was a sudden viral dissemination of a letter attributed to Osama bin Laden, in which he, of course, reviled the United States and the West and the, freedoms and all the rest of it, and extolled the virtues of Islam. And suddenly this was all the thing among young people in this country. It was interesting, after the dust settled a little bit, it was observed that it didn't go viral on Instagram. It didn't go viral on Facebook. It went viral on TikTok. And that seems to be just one example of how the algorithms and the weaponization, really, of TikTok by the CCP, which is favoring and trying to aid and abet Hamas and undermine Israel and undermine us, of course, it can be put to political purposes as well as indoctrination. Trevor, let me turn to you, if I can. One of the things that comes out of some of your ruminations about the Maoists of the 60s is that this is now quite beyond what Chinese nationals or Chinese second or third generation folks who, as we've seen, and you've been all about this, overseas Chinese police service centers, trying to understand that their loyalty has to be, even if they didn't come from China directly, it has to be to the motherland and has to be, doing what it tells them to do and so on. But we've clearly got a cohort of American Marxists. And what I'm interested in is some of your analysis of the extent to which, and I think you've all sort of touched on this, but extent to which it is really enabled by the CCP's United Front Work Department or intelligence services or others to be infinitely more dangerous than it would otherwise be. And you might say a little bit about the connection to Black Lives Matter as an example of the phenomenon.
To Nicholas's point, the US Constitution doesn't guarantee the free speech of foreign adversaries. It guarantees the free speech of American citizens. So we shouldn't be squeamish at all. See, back in the old days, one of the ways the Soviet Union used to subsidize the American Communist Party, they would buy 100,000 copies every week of People's World, the Communist Party newspaper, and send it out all over the Soviet Union. They would buy the newspaper, and this would be a weekly subsidy to the Communist Party. Now the Chinese and the Russians, they basically drive traffic to websites. They make tweets go viral. They make X posts go viral. They make whatever they want to go viral, so the owner of the website gets the revenue from that. That's how the Chinese and the Russians influence public opinion, plus subsidize their agents in this country. To your point, the Chinese are very much behind Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter was started by the Chinese Progressive Association of San Francisco, a community organizing group which has worked for the Chinese since 1972. And I've got them on tape talking about the direction, how they go and they put they run their messaging past the Chinese consul, that their job, they said this, their job was to protect China by destroying President Trump. In their own words, I have them on tape. And I have, the Freedom Road people who did the rioting all over America right after George Floyd. I have them on tape. These are openly pro-Chinese communist groups that have their people in China, have Maoist iconography all over their websites, and praise Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping and whatever, the great leaders. So yes, these groups would be insignificant without foreign backing. The Communist Party USA would have never done what it did without 100 years of subsidies from the Soviet Union, training, direction, backing, all of this. And the on-the-ground Maoists and communists could not do what they're doing today without the backing of China and Venezuela and Cuba and North Korea. There's books out there, American Marxism. American Marxism was built in the Soviet Union and China and Cuba, and still is to this day. So if we want to stop American Marxism, we cut off the money, we cut off the support, and we prosecute people in our country who are taking direction from our enemies. When we do that, we'll fix the problem pretty darn quick.
Brian Kennedy, finally to you. We're having this conversation, of course, in the context of an election. We're agreed that it is imperative that the political figures running for office be challenged to address this problem set and to be forthright about both their assessment of the magnitude of it, of course, but also what they would do about it if elected. I wanted to ask you, though, we had a conversation with a senior official, who probably should remain nameless because it was an off-the-record conversation last week, in which you had an opportunity to talk a bit about the election integrity problem. And on these webinars in the past and elsewhere, you have been very convincing about the degree to which the Chinese can, in fact, and are trying to influence and affect the outcomes of these elections, and that they've got a variety of ways of doing so, including, you've described manufacturing ballots and mailing them in with what appear to be perfectly legitimate, signatures on them by American voters, registered American voters. You had an idea in this conversation, and I wondered if you are in a position to talk a little bit about it, as to what can be done to try to shore up the integrity of the mail-in balloting process.
The main piece of it is making sure that our postal service can actually process all of these and are actually looking at whether there are good ballots or bad ballots, where are the ballots coming from. I mean, one problem with the use of mail-in ballots in this country is the fact that it's a system that's built really for fraud. And there used to be a bipartisan consensus among Democrats and Republicans. Jimmy Carter represented the Democrats, and James Baker, former Secretary of State, represented the Republicans. Simply said, a mail-in ballot system you can manipulate from a variety of ways. In this election coming up in 53 days now, I think, there'll be mail-in ballots used in many of the swing states, all of the swing states at some level. The Post Office and the House Oversight Committee in Congress should be taking a hard look at whether the ballots that are coming into the system are real or not. Because once they get into the system, they're going to get counted, unfortunately. That needs to be done. I think there needs to be a whistleblower program, a variation of that when it comes to voter fraud around the country, of the kind that Trevor talked about when it came to Chinese communist spies. A whistleblower program that actually required that people who are cheating would know, so they would know that if they are caught, they're going to go to jail, that someone could get paid up to $100,000 if they were able to prosecute someone engaging in fraud. Something to where the cheating that could go on could be stopped or at least deterred. My working theory has been, and forgive me that I use this number quite often, Communist China spends at minimum $16 billion a year in the United States in intelligence and influence operations. The idea that they would not use a fraction of that to try to, change the outcome of an election is simply naive. They have the capacity, they have the interest. They will use whatever they can and can get away with in order to manipulate this election. Our side is not doing enough to stop it. Congress needs to step up. The House of Representatives and their oversight need to operate at a level they've not previously operated on, which is examining the Postal Service, and that everyday citizens take their vote very seriously, that they treat this with the seriousness that is required. That today is not happening. It needs to happen. And until the American people and their representatives believe that an election can be stolen and that something needs to be done about it, we're going to be living in this very precarious place. Because if we do have an election and it does look like it was stolen and there is turmoil in the United States, who is the winner of that? Communist China. They would like nothing more than a divided United States. And none of us have any interest in allowing that to happen.
Yeah. I guess I come back at the end of all of this with the simple, perhaps, prescription that this set of issues involving the Chinese Communist Party, their agenda vis-a-vis America, the myriad ways in which they are pursuing it, the cumulative implications of all of that, and not least the challenge involved in countering it, especially with all of the various issues that we've discussed, from their penetration of our society, their capture of our elites, the suppression of information that runs against their interests and all the rest. But it does seem to me that the conclusion that must be drawn from all of this is that we, the people, as well as the candidates seeking our votes, need to ensure that this is a topic of conversation, not just a conversation. This is a central decision in this election season, not just at the presidential level, by the way, but right on down the ballot. Because, my friends, one way or the other, we will find ourselves, I'm pretty sure, fighting a war with China. And the chances of that happening are infinitely greater if we persist in pretending that's not so. And that we fail to take the sort of steps that might dissuade them from going there, which is pretty much where we are now. And it is reinforced, I can't help but say this, it is reinforced powerfully by the fact that there's no discussion of this taking place to speak of. So I call personally, and I think on behalf of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, it's what we've been about for the past 5 years. It's what, under Brian's leadership, we're redoubling our efforts to do, including with these road shows in swing states around the country, is to get the public demanding to know what their would-be representatives think about China, would do about China, and are prepared to help others do, especially at the presidential level, to alter the course, the trajectory of our country in this most strategic of respects. And I would simply say, in a manner like Ronald Reagan changed the trajectory vis-a-vis the previous threat from a communist regime that sought the destruction of this country. We should take inspiration from it. We should, I believe, model our approaches on some of those that worked with Reagan without firing a shot, no less, and that are more needed today than even in the heyday of the Cold War and the Soviet Union at its prime. It's been a privilege to present this to you. I apologize for the earlier technical difficulties. I want to thank the extraordinary panel that we were able to put together on fairly short notice. Our friend Sam Faddis via video, Nick Efetmiras, as well as Trevor Loudon and Brian Kennedy. I thank you all profoundly for participating today, and especially to all of those of you who have begun your weekend with a late afternoon program of the Committee on the Present Danger China. I hope you come back for more next week. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe. Didi will make this point as well. Please subscribe at presentdangerchina.org so you never miss one of these randomly scheduled programs, mostly due to my scheduled vicissitudes. But thank you, everybody, and most especially to our wonderful team, Didi Logason and Oleg Atbashian. Back to you, Didi. God bless you.
Thank you, Frank. A video of this webinar will be posted to presentdangerchina.org within a day of the conclusion of our program. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. We are on Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com, where you can subscribe and you will get notices about these webinars. Join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how CCP captured elites betray the USA. Thanks for being here today, and goodbye.